Probably one of the most important nodes within the n8n ecosystem is going to be your HTTP request node. Why? Well, this allows you to work with APIs. If you want to receive external data for your AI orchestration workflows, well, you need to often connect to APIs. n8n makes it easy in a lot of cases, and you have native API integrations. However, not all apps are going to be built into n8n. In addition, not all endpoints within an app are going to be in n8n. So that's why you're often seeing an HTTP request within workflows that are shared online. Now, while this is an amazing node, a lot of people struggle with the HTTP request node. It's going to probably take me a little bit over an hour, but my goal is to have the best video on YouTube talking about the HTTP request node, walk your hand through multiple examples, and build up your knowledge as the video progresses. What we're going to be covering specifically, the methods like post, get, put, patch, as well as delete. And we'll talk about query parameters, headers, as well as bodies, the differences between fields below, as well as utilizing JSON, a few different examples of authorization using the HTTP request tool with an AI agent. And then we'll finally round out this video with some of the common errors in the 400s or 500s, as well as some basic batching. Along the way too, we're going to go through official API documentation so you can see exactly the type of words and where to find this type of documentation to set up your node correctly. Really quick, before we jump into this video, if you need any help with your n8n workflows or any data needs I am taking on customers, you can find my contact below in the description. All right, let's jump right into this video. Okay guys, so we're here in n8n, and I just want to show you that this is going to be a pretty extensive video. This isn't going to be a video that's 5 minutes. Hey, here is, post, here is get. Congrats, you know how to use the HTTP request node. My goal is to get you guys through all of these examples. And you can see I'm still scrolling all the way down. I'll show you a bunch of different use cases, so that way you're familiar with it. Now, the thing with HTTP request node is there's always going to be some sort of variance. I can't cover every single case, but we're going to go through at least 3 different APIs. We're going to go through quite a lot of details and things like that along the way. So let's jump into this video. And the first thing I want to cover is, when do you want to use the HTTP request? Well, this is when you want to use it to access APIs. I'm going to show you 2 use cases where we're not going to access APIs with GET, but mostly this video is going to be focused about using APIs. And this is when 2 applications are going to speak to each other. Now, the most common use case is when a node is not in n8n. So n8n does a really good job of adding in nodes, but unfortunately it can't have everything. For example, in the past, Apify wasn't a node in n8n. Now there's a community node associated with it, but in the past you had to set up an HTTP request to access Apify. Same with Firecrawl. So the n8n team does a great job of adding in nodes. And there's a lot of nodes also that are going to be community nodes that companies create, and they want to put this into n8n. This video is actually being recorded on my Cloud account, but Cloud does have some community nodes. However, it's not as extensive if you're using self-hosted. Self-hosted has the most community nodes. So if you don't want to set up an HTTP request, check if there's a node there first. The other side of it is sometimes n8n is limited. So for example, HubSpot or Monday.com, there is, and I should even put Airtable in here because it's another example. Airtable, right? There's tons and tons of API actions, but n8n doesn't have them all. So just to give you an example, we go to HubSpot, right? And you can see over here we have HubSpot, and there's 31 actions, which seems like it's a ton, and it is a ton, but there's even more with the HubSpot API. And you can see there's 18 triggers over here. Triggers are going to be another video in particular, webhooks, which we'll talk about in the next video in this series. But this doesn't encompass everything in HubSpot. So sometimes you'll have to set up a HTTP request node to link into HubSpot. Okay, so again, try to see if the action item you want to take first is in a native node, right? So like if you want to go into Airtable, you can see Airtable has quite a few things. Get many bases, get base schema, create a record, create or update a record, delete a record, get a record, search records, update record. And if it's not, you're going to have to use HTTP request node. And again, if the tool that you want to connect to isn't here in n8n, we're going to have to use the HTTP request. So just to show you where HTTP request is, you just type in HTTP and you'll see we have the HTTP request. It says make an HTTP request and returns the response data. And there's also the tool, which I'm going to include in this video because I don't want to have it in a separate video. Next steps. What you're going to want to do as well is read over the API docs. This will tell you specifically how to set up this node. And what I would recommend first is you Google search your app or website plus API docs. That's going to be your first way of trying to find the documents, right? So what I would want to do for Airtable is I would search Airtable API docs. And you can see if I go over here, I searched Airtable API documentation and it says Introduction to Airtable Web API. So you can click on that. And we have this also over here, API. It talks about record limits and different things like that. You can go over here and you'll find it. API reference introduction, everything that you need to know to set up this HTTP request and really do what you want within Airtable. And the second is to look for a developer tab on a website. So you can see this is /developers in the URL. Often that's going to be the case if you're searching through something. So you can see over here, SerpAPI. We go on that side of things and we'll just go to the home page. So we go over here into the bottom and it actually has all of our documentation over here, which is really nice. So again, you could either go on the website and look for like a documentation section, a developers section, or Google search it. And lastly, if you're not having luck with those two, search with Perplexity. So I've used this quite a bit. If I'm trying to find some sort of documentation or some threads on how to set things up, Perplexity is amazing on that side of things. It's essentially an AI search engine. And yeah, I've covered Perplexity in another video talking about how you can use it as a tool to get real-time information, but I would recommend also just searching through Perplexity. So these are your three options to find API docs. Go through these and look on that side of things. The other thing to mention is some APIs are going to be completely free while others are going to be paid. Some are also going to have trials and different credits that you can purchase and things like that. Again, just going into SerpAPI, you can see pricing. So $75 a month, you get 5,000 searches. Production, 15,000 searches. Big data, 30,000 searches, but they have a free version, which allows you to get 250 searches a month. We're going to be using this free version here in today's video, just to show you quickly a different API. And I haven't even used SerpAPI, I don't believe, outside this video, but this will be a use case. Okay, so there's that side of it. And again, just to show you that there's some native nodes versus the HTTP requests. So this is just an example, and we're going to actually set this up over here for SerpAPI. And this is our HTTP request. So we have a method, we have our URL, authentication. Don't worry, we're going to cover all these sections, breaking it down completely for you guys. We also have an API key, which is super important to secure this. We'll cover that as well in this video. But you also have this native node, and set up your account. All the stuff is hidden, and you can just search, Google search, a query, location if you want that, and you have additional fields that you can add in over here. But again, every node's gonna be a little bit different on that side. Okay, so that's the basics, right? Again, API is the main purpose of the HTTP request. We'll be using it for other things. The main key on here is to expand out specific tools if the action isn't here in n8n, or if that tool or website isn't here in n8n at all, you're going to have to use the HTTP request. And again, you can search through documentation. There's a few different ways over here to look for it. And again, some are free and some are paid. I didn't mean for this to take so long to go through this first part, but it's super important to get you in, at least have the basic knowledge. Okay. Now, this is a very critical component of an API, so please pay attention over here. So what we're covering today is a REST API. This is the most popular type of API out there, and we're going to cover some of the different options that you can set. So there's four that you'll often see. You have something called GET, you'll have something called post, put or patch, and then delete. So let's break them down one at a time, as well as show you where that is in the HTTP request. So again, just going over here in the beginning, the first thing you'll see is the method here at the top. So you have all of these over here. You have delete, get, head, options, patch, post, and put. So these are the ones that you're going to be using like 99% of the time. So that's why I wanted to cover those in this video. So get is you're going to be receiving data from a website. Post is you're going to be creating data on that website or app in some sort of capacity. Put or patch is you're going to be updating the data, and then delete is going to be removing data. Now, some APIs may only have get or post. Airtable, for example, has all of these. You can get data from a spreadsheet on the site. You can post. You can essentially add in a new row. You can put or patch. You can update that data, right? Or you can delete. You could remove a row in a spreadsheet. And we're going to be covering Airtable a little bit later in the video, specifically for the put, patch, and delete. But some, again, may only have get or post. Some will have all of these over here. Sometimes to get your job done, you may need to have multiple requests. So Apify in the past, you had to scrape and then also get the results. So to set the scraper, you had to post information. So create the data for the scraper. And then when the scraper is done, you had to get that data. So ideally, we would have two nodes next to each other. We would have a post, which creates the data for the scraper. And then we have the get, which is going to get our final results from the scraper. If you're not familiar with Apify, I have a few videos here on the channel about it, but it's a really awesome website to scrape social media, profiles, and things like that. And I have a few different setups here talking about that. But again, first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what method you want. It's going to be in the documentation. Make sure this is correct, because if it is not correct, you are going to have errors. So that is this first part, the method. Either get, you receive data from the API. Post, you're pushing data to the API and you're creating data in some capacity. Put or patch, you're updating the data over there. Or delete, you're going to be removing data. Get and post are going to be your most common ones. You're going to use put/patch or delete occasionally. Next one we're going to talk about is the endpoint. And the endpoint is going to be this URL. So it says URL to make the request to. When you're working with APIs, you'll see this labeled as an endpoint. And the thing is, when you're working with complicated APIs, or not even complicated APIs, but just APIs in general that are pretty large, you're going to have multiple endpoints, and you'll have to make sure that you have the correct URL for the scenario. Sometimes you'll want to pass in information from previous nodes, which we're going to cover a little bit later here in the video. Sometimes you just want to have things that are static. So for example, SerpAPI, we have two different endpoints. We have one for Google Flights and one for Google Hotels. So imagine you are doing some research and you're going to build an application that utilizes SerpAPI for travel. So you have one API endpoint for flights and you have a different API endpoint for hotels. We're still using the SerpAPI, but we're using different URLs associated with it. And it's in the documentation. So I literally just grabbed the documentation. It says a user may query the following. It has this endpoint over here. It says utilizing a get request. So going back, right? Our method over here, it tells us use get. Okay. Head to the playground for a live and interactive demo. And just to show you the documentation again, if you don't believe me, we're going to load this up over here. And what I do is just search for flight. So here's our Google Flights API. And it says our Google Flights API allows you to scrape flight results from Google Flights. The API is accessed through the following endpoint, which is our URL, right? Remember our URL on this side of it. We paste that in here and it has it over here. So a user may query the following using a get request. So it tells us here's the URL that we want to use. Here is the method you want to use. And then there's another section talking about parameters. And we're going to cover parameters here in a second, but it's all in this documentation. Some of these parameters are going to be optional. Some of these are going to be required. And you can see we have all the information we need. It gives us an API example. Lots of really good information, great documentation in my own personal opinion. Some websites are going to have mediocre documentation. Some are going to have great documentation. So if it has mediocre, you can research Perplexity, you could research forums, different things like that. If it has good documentation, you're not going to need it. Like SerpAPI, really good documentation in my personal opinion. Okay, so next side of it, it seems like there's a lot going on. So one shortcut you could use is using curl. And this is a shortcut to filling in all of the settings here in n8n for us. Do is import in the client URL, which that's what curl stands for, and the HTTPS and the HTTP request will fill out everything else. Now it won't completely fill out everything to our security specs, which we're going to cover that a little bit later, but it'll get us probably 80 to 90% of the way done. In addition, what the really nice thing about curl is you can find it in the documentation. And inside this node, you notice here at the very top, it says import curl. And all we're going to have to do is paste this in on the side of things and it will fill out everything. And I'll show you that here in a second, right? Our first example is actually going to cover curl to start with SerpAPI. So just stay with it here for a second. A few other minor things I want to explain before we jump into that example. The next side of it is 3 potential sections to fill out with an API. So what you'll notice on this HTTP request is we have these sections over here. So we have something that says send query parameters. We have something that says send headers and then send body. So send query parameters, whether the request has query params or not. Send header, whether the request has headers or not. Send body, whether the request has a body or not. And if it's your first time jumping in over here, this might not make any sense. Okay, when do I use query parameters? When do I use headers? When do I use body? You know, if I click on this, it says use fields below or use JSON. That doesn't really help. If I click on headers, you have the same options, but then when we go to body, there's actually quite a lot. You can see everything over here on that side of it. And again, what I'll remind you is the documentation will tell you what sections you need to fill out. Some parts are going to be required, some aren't. So this is the typical use cases, but it's not always the case because people can design their APIs how they like. So first, if you're going to use a query, this is going to be some sort of filter. The header is typically used for authorization or the metadata of your request, which could be like a content type. This is also where you store some of your security information, which we're going to cover a little bit later. And lastly, your body holds the data for a request. Again, sounds a little bit confusing, but when we jump through some examples, it'll make a lot more sense. And again, this isn't always the case. Sometimes things are going to be switched around, but this is what it should be. Next, you'll see authentication, and I should have just duplicated this over here. And you'll see this authentication section. Now, this is very important. You'll typically see this under an application as an API key or a token or something like that in that verbiage. I want to cover that with you guys, but I don't want to overload you with information. So we're going to go through a few different examples. We're just going to set these up very basic, and then we're going to add in the authentication a little bit later because truly, I think we've covered a lot already, and I don't want to have an overload of information. So just to recap before we jump into our first example. So what you need to know, number 1, read the documentation. Number 2, it's going to be one of these 4 methods. Number 3, grab the specific URL you need. Number 4, curl is going to be a major shortcut for you guys. And number 5, look at filling out the sections, query parameters, header, body. And then there's going to be some sort of authentication. We're not going to focus too much on that right now because that's going to be a little bit later here in this video. So where I want to start with you guys is we're going to start with a get example because I find get is very common to use. In addition, we're going to use query parameters and we're just going to use fields below. So let's jump into that and we're going to use the SerpAPI search API. So we have this on here. Also, it's kind of nice is it has an API uptime on here. So it tells you what's going on that side of things. And what we're going to do is this is going to be our final results on this side of it. And I just want to show you how we get this. So I'm just going to create a brand new HTTP request node, and we're going to fill this out one at a time. So let's go over here. And what I'm looking for on here is curl. So first, what I want to do is when I'm in the documentation, I know I'm in the right section. I'm just going to Control F and I'm going to search for curl. And you'll see over here, it says code to integrate. And you have all these different options. By default, this is on Ruby. Now, I never used Ruby. I'm not familiar with it at all. But you see over here, it says C URL, right? That is what we are going to utilize. So this is perfect on that side of it. And you can see there's other options, Python, which I've used Python in the past. Actually, I use Python on a daily basis for my full-time job. You have JavaScript over here, which some developers in n8n are going to be very familiar with JavaScript. Personally, I'm not familiar with JavaScript. I do think there's some benefits of knowing JavaScript, but right now I focus mainly on Python. And so you have Go, PHP, Java, Rust.NET. You have this Google Sheets, which is actually kind of interesting. I haven't really played with it, but we're going to be using this curl on that side of things. So what we're going to do is copy this code, and then we're going to go into this HTTP request. And what you're going to see at the very top, it says import curl. We're going to click on that, and we're just going to paste the curl command here. And it says this will overwrite any changes you've already made in the current node, and that's perfectly fine. So we're just going to copy this over here. Again, this is all default. I haven't changed anything else. We're going to click import. And you can see in real time, it changed this up. So first, we're using our get method, which it mentions this over here. Again, in the documentation, go to the top, it says get. So, get requests, so that's fine. And we have the URL that's been filled up over here, serpapi.com/search. We have no authentication, and we technically do have authentication, but we haven't really set this up on here, which is why I mentioned we're going to cover this a little bit later. You'll notice that this API uses query parameters. So if we go down, it's not using send headers. It's not using send body. All it's focused on is the query parameters, which is interesting. Then what we have is each of these query parameters defined. So it says name, engine, and then the value of Google. Name Q. So like this is the query that you're going to search. In the documentation, it says you need to have this set as Q. So again, if we go through our documentation, it says search query, it has Q, and it says this is a required field. So if you don't include this required field, you are going to get an error. And it says parameter defines the query you want to search. You can use anything that you would use in a regular Google search. In URL, site, and title, we also support advanced search query parameters over here, which I'm not familiar with these. See full list. So this is what we're searching Google for in the SerpAPI. And this is a required field. So you have to put this in. So let's make sure that's there. It says location. So this automatically filled out Seattle, Washington, which I've been there once. Then we have HI. Now I'm not familiar with what HI is on here, so maybe I want to do some research. So this is parameter defines the language to use for Google search. It's a 2-letter language code. Now, I already kind of knew this because of EN over here. My assumption that this was English, but that's okay. Then you have GL. Now, GL might not sound familiar. So it says parameter defines the country to use for Google search. Okay, GL, US, that makes sense. Google domain. So, by default, if you fill this out, if you don't know something, go to the documentation, search for it. And often you'll have some documentation over here to the side that tells you exactly what it is, right? GL, again, first time looking it over, you might not know. Over times, if you use the same API constantly, you'll pick up that domain knowledge, but your first time you might not know. So just check through everything on that side of things. You can see there's also advanced filters and different things like that across the board. And I would really recommend that you check this out. Other thing, it says API key and it says secret API key. So this is kind of your password for the API. And what you're going to do is get that. And I'm not logged into SerpAPI on here, which is why it didn't give me an API key. If I was signed in, actually, it populates the API key. And just to show you, because when I was signed in, I actually did this, and you can see my API key is right here. Now, it'll be blurred out or have a black box here on the video, but it filled that out automatically. And just to show you guys, I'm just going to sign in and show you where this is at. Okay. And typically where you'll find your API key, a few different places. What I always try to look at is an account page. So you can see it has my API key right over here. SERP API, again, has pretty great documentation. You can even go over here to API key and it gives it to you right there. Or when you do the curl request, sometimes it'll auto-populate your API key. So again, if I just go over here to curl and actually check this out this time, you can see my API key is right over here. So again, it's going to be blurred out for this video, but it's kind of nice that this has already been built out. And to mention another time, this is not the best approach to put your API key in over here. And why I mentioned that curl gets you probably like 80 to 90% there. Maybe you don't want to have all of these parameters and you want to remove some of these. You obviously don't want to keep your API key over here. We'll cover that reason why shortly, but it's nice because it does definitely save you some time. Okay, so that's example one. Now example two is to show you this with JSON. So we went over here, we did use fields below, and you can see we went through each of these. We had the field, we had the value, field value, field value, but we can also have this as JSON. And you can see over here, the JSON side of it, right? We have engine, Google, question, fresh bagels, location. So this is the same exact information, just in key value pairs. So sometimes when you look through documentation, it might give you example JSON, and you can just copy and paste that JSON over here. I've done this a lot in the past when working with Apify data. I just copy in the example JSON and I change what's needed. And it's actually a little bit faster, in my personal opinion, to just go over here and change things rather than going over here and doing fields below. I think fields below is nice if you have like 2 or 3 things in general that you're going to be using. But when you're using a lot, I feel using JSON is a little bit faster. And you have 2 different options. You have fixed or expression. So if you have something that's coming in a little bit earlier and you want to paste this into the JSON, I would recommend using expression. Again, we'll cover this a bit in the video, but by default, this is going to be fixed and static. So this will get me the same exact result as well. Another thing to mention, and I actually didn't put this in the video, but to save you API costs, like when you're testing this and you have results. So let me see, I don't have any results over here. Let me just execute this step shortly for you guys. And you can see I have all of these results. So imagine this is just one node in a full workflow. What I recommend when using APIs is just pin this data so that way you don't get API cost. So when I showed you my screen for SerpAPI, it said 1 of 250 for free. I run this again. Now we're at 2 of 250. So if I'm worried about the cost associated with it, just pin your data. And then this data is stored here in n8n, and you're not going to have another API run associated with your key. So that is essentially example 1 and example 2. The only thing that we changed with these is we changed from fields below into JSON. And again, just to show you one last time, fields below, we define each of these over here versus JSON. We just populate all of this on that side of things. JSON I find to be a little bit cleaner and faster. We're going to get a little bit off topic, but I just wanted to show you 2 other things that you can grab really quick with Get. So you can actually download images online with Get. So all you have to do is paste in a URL of an image over here as the URL. Get, you don't have to do any authentication, no query parameters, header or body. And you can see we have this that's populated our binary data. You can see the 4th tab over here. And if you want to see what image I grabbed, well, my baseball team is the Tampa Bay Rays, and our stadium got destroyed by a hurricane last year. And yeah, I don't know why I chose that picture, but I decided to grab that for this video. So you can see we just grabbed this online, and the URL on the side of it, this one right over here. So just right click an image online, copy image address, paste it in over here. It could be helpful in your own workflow, but that's how we can grab an image really nice and quick and easy online and throw it into n8n. So that's just one of the ways over here. You can technically download it, although I don't find that super helpful right now, but yeah, you can throw that in over here. Another thing, which, you know, this one I don't find as helpful, but it is a use case of Get, is grabbing a website. Now, I would recommend that you go other approaches if you're going to typically try to grab website information. Specifically in n8n, you can use Firecrawl. I've used other ways to scrape websites. outside of n8n. I actually have a few scraping videos on that side of it, but regardless, I can go over here. I can say get, I'll put in my website over here, Ryan Matt Data Science, and I can click execute step. And this will grab the information specifically for this URL. And I don't know why it's taking a little bit to execute. And you can see over here, we have all this information from the homepage of my website. And there's ways to clean up all this as well if you really wanted to. I'm not covering that in this video. My goal is to get you guys up and going with APIs, but since we're already covering HTTP requests, I just wanted to show you two other common use cases that I've seen people post online with GET, grabbing an image or grabbing a website. All right, so we covered GET, and I want to jump into an example now that uses both post and GET. The example we're going to be using is on Apify. And what we're going to be using is this Instagram profile scraper. Something that I've used quite a lot on Apify because I've had a few different customers with that, one within the fitness industry and then one within the music industry. So it's very popular just to get the Instagram follower amount for people that sign up for an application of some sort. Regardless, what we use both for, we use post because we're going to send data to Apify and we want to run the scraper. And then we're going to use get, and get's going to grab the data from Apify. So we're going to use both of these to get the information that we want. And this is an example of posting, right? Which is going to create data, again, run the scraper. And then we're going to get the data, which we essentially did in those previous examples above. So let me show you how to set this up over here. Also, setting up the API and this HTTP request is going to be a little bit different. And to mention, if you are a fan of Apify, they have a native node now. If you go over here to Apify, you can see we have that over here. And you have different actions like run an actor, which we're going to do over here. And then also get data set items, which we're going to do on that side of it. And actually you can run actor and get data set all together in one node. But for this use case, we're going to use our HTTP request. Okay. So how we're going to do this, we go over here. First thing we take a look at is our API. And we go over here and we say, oh, there's API endpoints. And if you remember from earlier in the video, API endpoints are going to be those URLs. And what's really nice about the documentation on Apify is it tells you, hey, this is a post to run the actor. So it says runs this actor. The post payload includes content type header that passes input to the actor, JSON, right? And it says the actor started with default options. You can override them using various URL query parameters. And you'll see it has this URL. However, at the very end, we have these 3 stars. And you might be wondering, that's kind of weird. Well, in this case, our token is going to be our API key. So it says token equal, and they have these 3 stars to hide that from you. Because imagine you're making content like I am, or someone's looking over your computer. You don't want to share your password. And if you really want to see your password, you're going to click on this icon over here. Now I'm just going to do it for this video. I'm going to edit this out and post, and you can see this is my API key. So what we want to do is copy this full URL into our HTTP request. And we're going to paste this over here in the URL. And we're starting off with the post because we want to run the actor. We're going to paste this in over here. And we're going to have to fill out this JSON here in a second. I'll show you where that is at. Now, what we're going to do is grab our JSON, and you can see over here, it's really nice. Check this out. We have JSON, and you have this curly brace. So you have usernames, and we have these over here. Now I'm just going to grab a few of these just to get started, and you can see usernames, and I just grabbed those over here. I closed it out, and we are good to go. Now I've already stickied this pin, the data, I ran it. And then we have this information over here that just tells me my run, it was successful on this side of things. Okay. So again, just grab the JSON over here and just paste that JSON in. And you can see the JSON is used on the body this time. So we go over here to send body, and we just paste in the JSON. And I just fill it out like this, right? And I just fill it out like this. And what I want to show you guys as well is it even mentions over here, the URL contains your API token. Don't share them with untrusted parties. So it gives you that warning over here and why we have these 3 stars on that side of things. So we run our actor, we run our scraper, and then we want to get the data. So how do we get the data? Well, in the documentation, if we go down below, it says get last run dataset items. And this time it mentions there's a get. So all we have to do is go over here to get, paste in that URL, and it'll get the information. So it gets all this information about these influencers, follower accounts, and things like that across the board. Now I'm not going to share all of this info, but that is our get. Super, super basic. All we have to do is paste in the URL for our get over here, and it grabs the data that we essentially got from our post request. So our post request over here, we just specified some Instagram usernames. It's sent this over into that scraper. The scraper then gets the follower amounts, and then we just have to grab that information with get, and we have the info over here, plus additional information about these people in particular. Now, I wasn't focused on that. I was just focused on the followers, but use cases may vary. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, this time we're sending our data through body over here with this JSON. So super, super basic on that side of it. And the one before, it mentioned to put this into the query. So query parameters, this time it mentioned body. So that is why I specifically used body. It asked for a JSON body, and I pasted that in. So now there's security concerns. So you saw initially over here, if we share this with someone, they're going to get our token. If we shared this with someone, they're going to get our API key. So it's over here. So it's super important for us to hide this information. In addition, if I want to go use SerpAPI again, we're going to have to go and define this API key. It's not always ideal. If I want to go and use Apify again, I'm just going through over here. We're going to have to grab our token and paste that in the URL. So I just want to show you a few different approaches on authorization. In fact, we're going to go and fix our SerpAPI. We're going to fix Apify. And then I'm going to show you also Airtable, because Airtable is going to be some of the other examples here in this video. So let's go through all of these. First, though, let's talk about authorization, where you can find it. So at the top, we have our method. We covered that. We have our URL, which is our API endpoint. And then we have authentication. And you'll notice that the ones above, we use none. We didn't worry about authentication. That's not best approach. We want to actually authenticate. So you have two different ways to authenticate. You have predefined, or you have generic credential. Now, predefined is nice because if you go to predefined, it has all of these common APIs. So n8n knows, and they have a lot of common things that you want to use with APIs in here, but that's not ever going to be 100%. There's going to be things that are developed within the APIs that may lag getting into n8n. There's things that may never end up in n8n. So, what if you're using one of these APIs and we're only forced to use the actions that are in n8n? Well, it wouldn't be usable for most people. I know that for sure, because with customers, I've had to use custom HTTP requests specifically for Monday or QuickBooks. It's just not always going to be the case. So, these are all in here. So if you want to search for your credential, for example, Airtable, you can see Airtable as Airtable API, OAuth, Airtable Personal Access Token. We're going to cover this in a second, but you could also go to like Monday, right? And you can see Monday or OAuth API. Go in here to HubSpot. You have HubSpot API, developer. There's a lot in over here. So again, follow documentation, but if you're using some sort of app that's really, really popular, it might be in predefined credentials. Now, if it's not, don't fret, because we have something over here called generic credential type. And what you want to do is click that, and then you can see we have basic auth, bearer auth, custom auth, digest auth, header, OAuth, and query auth. So again, depending on the documentation, depends which ones you want to fill out. We're going to go over some examples here in a second. But those are your two options. So I'd always recommend look predefined first, because these are easier to set up. If it's not in predefined, go into generic and then set this up based off of the documentation. And again, I think that's pretty much my notes, right? So just double check that. Authentication, yep. We often have to authenticate the query parameters or in the header through an API key. That is correct. So I showed you the query parameters over there. I also showed you URL, which can happen. And don't think of your API key as the password to getting your data. So we've already talked about that. You don't want to share your API key. Other people can request on your behalf if you do, which is an issue. And if the API isn't free, you're spending a lot of money. Apify I pay $39 a month for. It's not free. SerpAPI, if above the 250 free runs, it costs you money. So if you're using that a lot, someone's gonna be spending what you put already into the platform. We hard coded these, which wasn't the best, as I showed you. The reason why is it exposes our API key when sharing a workflow. So if you do share this workflow, it's gonna grab all this information over here and send it out. So not secured. And that's a big issue on this. And as well as we already talked about, it's not reusable. So n8n supports credentials types, and we already covered predefined, right, for common APIs, and then generic if it's not predefined. So yeah, we've covered essentially all this stuff. This was just a good recap. Let's jump into 3 examples over here. The first one we're going to do is our SerpAPI, just based off the video. So again, we're going to use the get, we're going to use the Google search. And this time what we're going to do is look for the predefined credential type. And we're going to go and search for SerpAPI. Now I've already set this up for the video, but you can see there's SerpAPI. Just type in Serp and you can see SerpAPI on that side of things. And then what we're going to do is go over here and fill out this API. And again, I've already filled this out, but all I have to do is create a new credential and it just asks you for your API key. And what I would recommend is also you label this. So I'm not going to save this. I'm going to say close, but you can see over here for my example, I say SerpAPI account, I put my API key, and then if it's successful, you're going to get this pop-up over here that says connection tested successfully, which is great. That means your API key is set in over here. And then anytime you want to use SerpAPI, you can just go over here and say predefined credential type, look for SerpAPI, and then make sure to choose your account. You can have multiple accounts over here. So you can imagine you're setting things up for a customer or doing some other testing. So you can set these up on that side of things. That's why you're not limited to one. If you're limited to one, that'd be some issues. And then what you can see is we use the fields below. And this time we actually removed our API key. So this is the proper route if you want to use SerpAPI. Again, our curl got us 90% there. It gave us all this information, but it put our API key right over here. I would just recommend you remove the API key and you set this up with a predefined credential. Now let's take a look at an example of Apify. Now Apify does have a predefined credential, but let's pretend it does not, right? So we go over here, you can see, actually let me do another HTTP request just to show you. Let's go there, cool. So Apify does have an predefined. So if we go over here, predefined, and I go over here and I just scroll down, you can see Apify is in over here, but we're just going to pretend it doesn't. And we're going to fill out a generic. So and this time we're going to generic credential type. And this time we're looking for a query auth. So it's in the URL. So that's why we're using the query auth. And then what we're going to call this is Apify token on this side of it. So I just go over here and click the edit icon, or for you, you're going to have to create a new one. And what we're going to do is set our name to token. And why we do that, if you go back over here to this API, and we go to API endpoints, you notice it says token equals. So that gives us the hint that, hey, in this query, we're setting a token. A query, again, is our URL on the side of it. So we're setting this token. So this is like our API key, but it's just called token. So we just say token, and then this equals, and we just put our value, which is going to be whatever these 3 stars are. Again, I'll just show you mine. I'm going to hide it on the video, but mine's over there. And just paste that value, and then you should be good to go. And that is how you set up the query auth on the side of things. And again, we want to send our body. This is our body example over here from above. Now, Airtable is going to be a little bit different. So let me show you on this side of things, because Airtable is interesting. It goes through the opportunity, or goes through the example of an older API that got deprecated. So let's jump through that right now. So you're going to need an Airtable account. I literally just made my first Airtable account today. So I'm just going to log in on that side of things. Okay. And then I just built this very basic content calendar. So what I have is a topic name, description, progress, and then like the date I want to upload this on the YouTube channel. So, I'm going to actually cover this one a little bit later when we go into our AI agent. If you're watching this, I'm probably not going to stick to this. This is the HTTP request video. I'm hopefully getting this out on the 27th. I'm recording on Sunday. Webhooks I want to get out this week. Also, my first n8n hackathon probably going to be out. These, I don't know if they'll be out on these specific dates, but at least hackathon and HTTP requests, those two are going to be there for sure. But the whole thing with it is, I want to go and set up the API. I'm not, caring too much about this table rather than showing you some of the API requests. So what we're going to do is we're going to look for the Airtable API. So all I'm going to search is Airtable API documentation over here, and check this out. Introduction Airtable Web API. So I click into this over here and we start getting some information on this side of things. So what we have is the introduction, we have authentication with scopes, OAuth, errors, any rate limits associated with it, which we'll talk about rate limits here a little bit later in the video. So actually this is pretty important. So I'm just actually going to duplicate this because we're going to go talk about that a little bit later. You can get records, list records, etc. So the first part of it is like, hey, how do we actually set this up over here? And let's jump into it. So what I do first is I go over here and I go into our HTTP request, and we necessarily don't need to put an URL because I'm just setting this up for the first time. We're going to go into our predefined credential type. And then what we're going to do is look for Airtable. So we'll go over here as Airtable, and you'll notice there's three things in Airtable. We have Airtable API, we have Airtable OAuth, and then we have Airtable Personal Access Token API. So you might be wondering like, hey, which one of these should I set up? So let's try to find that. Okay. And what I did is I just went to my account first because I want to find my API key. Again, we were going through the documentation over here, and it talked about like what's going on, and you can see types of tokens as of February 1st. Deprecation period for the Airtable API keys has ended. Users of Airtable API must migrate to the new authentication methods to continue using Airtable API. See this article for more information. So, hey, something's been deprecated. Maybe I can find out some more information. And it says creating personal access tokens. Okay, so this is our hint. Going back over here, we go to Airtable, right? You can see it says personal access tokens. It says API has been deprecated, and now everyone needs to have a personal access token. So I just click and I create a new one over here, and then I paste in our access token, and it says make sure you enable the following scopes for your token. So sometimes when you work with APIs, you're not going to get permissions to everything. You're going to have to set these up individually because maybe you want to give an API key to someone else and you don't want them to be able to delete a record in your table. So maybe you only want them to read. But some other people, it's okay for them to read or write or whatever the case may be. So you have to set up scopes for your API key. And how I did that, let me just go over here. I went over here into this developer section. So I just clicked on this developer hub, and it mentions over here personal access tokens, and I just created a token. So name your token, let's say like token test. And then what you want to do is add those scopes as needed. So I just added in all these for this video. But again, if you're sharing stuff, make that as you want. And then I just gave all resources. So just add all resources on that side of it. And then you'll get this API key or token over here. Again, I'm going to just blur this out, and you just want to copy that into n8n. So again, just going into n8n, I just put my access token on here. It says, make sure you enable the following scopes. Yep, I've added those, and we are good to go. Okay. And again, right, if you used an API key in the past that's been deprecated, and if you're looking at this for the first time, you might be confused. You're like, hey, well, there's an API key, there's token, there's OAuth. What do I use? Again, just follow the guide. I went in over here. I saw that API keys were no longer used. I saw that they used tokens. I followed the developer docs, went into the tokens. And again, it's nice that they gave us warnings over here. Not all documentation will be as nice. Obviously, Airtable is a pretty big company. They do a great job with documentation as well, because they literally just solved this in just a few minutes. And yeah, so good on that side of things. Why I wanted to use Airtable though, because I wanted to show you guys put/patch and then also a delete example. So again, how do I find this? And I'm just going to close out some of this stuff over here because we don't need this right now. What I did is I went through their documentation, and I've wanted to find update record, and you can see patch or put's okay. And then we have the URL on the side of things. And again, some documentations will say patch only, some will say put only, some may have both, but ideally they're both just updating a record. And you can see we have a base ID, a table ID, and then also a record ID associated with that. So imagine you're in a workflow and things like that. And how are we going to pass these over into this URL? So what I just did on this example is I just set an edit fields, and I just put a base ID, which is the base ID in my account, the table ID, and then record ID. I found this actually just going to the URL over here. And I said, okay, well, that's the base, that's the table, right? What's the specific record that I want to update? I open this up. Okay, that's the record. It has record REC in the URL. So I kind of just played with it and found it from that side of things. And I pasted all these over here. And I said, hey, I want to update this. So what I did is I just followed the documentation. I put all these in over here. And you can see if I just execute this previous node, it'll populate. Well, I need to set a trigger. So let me actually set a trigger really fast on that side of it. Just drag and drop this over here. Sometimes it's a little finicky or not if I need a trigger in n8n, but that's okay. We'll execute this step. And then you'll see we have all these that are getting populated in the URL, right? So that's our URL for updating. We set a patch, but you could also put. It mentions that in the documentation, patch or put. So I'm just going to set patch. Predefined credential type. Again, we showed you how to set this up over here. And then I'm going to send a body because we want to send our request over here. And then I just want to update some fields. So I've already updated this earlier when I was doing testing. n8n filter version 2, filter a lot of data. So let's just make this new. We'll say version 3, filter lots of data live on YouTube. I don't know. And we'll still say it's completed, and we'll change the date this time to 11/7. And I'll click execute step. And it says node executed successfully. So if we go back over into our Airtable, you can see it has me going over here. It made that update in real time. You just saw it change, and 11/7/2025. So awesome. We were able to do an update with put or patch. And lastly, hey, I actually want to delete this. So how am I going to delete this over here? So this actually has the same structure on this side of it. So if you go over here into the documentation, okay, base ID, table ID, record ID, this time we just put delete. So I actually want to delete this record, n8n filter v3. I find it a little bit annoying, and I don't want this in over here now. So let's delete that. So this time we're going to go through, and actually let's change this up. I want to actually delete this one to add n8n error handling. So I'm just going to grab this new record ID over here because I actually want to build this live with you guys. So what we're going to do is paste that into the string for this record ID. Again, we're going to grab this over here, and then I don't need a body because we're not updating anything. We're just deleting. And then we're changing this method over here to delete. Again, we have our base ID, table, record, and we're just going to delete that record. So let's see if that worked correctly. I'm going to click delete, and it says deleted true. Here's the ID. So we go back over into our table, and it's gone. Sweet. So again, put patch, right? This is just updating the values. Delete is just deleting it. So what I want to show you now, and hopefully that makes sense, right? Again, update, put patch, delete is delete. What I want to show you now is we can actually add an HTTP request to an AI agent. I do want to mention that I think in the future, MCP is going to take this over completely. So the thing with MCP, which stands for Model Context Protocol, this is a way of assigning tools to an AI agent. And a lot of companies are investing a lot of resources into building out MCP servers, which have a bunch of different tools, and you can specify what tools you want within your AI agent. Now, I have a full video on MCP, so I highly recommend you check that out. It's going to be a little bit later on in this series because I think you need to know HTTP requests before you learn MCP. But I think in the future, this is not the way to go. I think every company will have their own MCP servers. You attach that to an AI agent and you specify what tools you specifically want. However, since that is not the case as of yet, you will find use cases of still adding in HTTP requests to connect to an API. So I just want to give you that context that MCP will take this over here in the future. So if you're watching this a year or 2 years in the future and MCP is completely taken over, like understandable, like again, I'm recording this in 2025, MCP is getting popular, but hasn't been fully rolled out. If MCP dies out and everyone says, hey, you should always just put in an HTTP request to use APIs within your AI agents, it's still in here. So either way, I just wanted to kind of hedge my bet on that side of things and tell you like MCP on that side of it. So what I want to do is kind of walk you through this process on it. So ideally what you want to do is you want to describe your tool to the AI agent and then have a description on it. So what I want to do for this AI agent is first set up a system message. So I said your helpful assistant that adds records to Airtable. A tool called Airtable Add Record will allow you to do this. A user will give you an idea for a YouTube video, and your goal is to extract the info and put it in these fields: topic name, description, status, date, proposed. Here is an example of JSON to send to the API. So this is the exact JSON that we used for the edit. It's the same thing if you want to add, right? So what we're doing is adding a new record. I have the JSON over here that I specifically want. And again, that's that JSON that you would see in the body, right? So I'm just specifying this in our system prompt. And then what I have over here is Airtable Add Record. That's the tool name. I relabeled this and I said, use this tool to add a new record to Airtable. I put in specifically that URL that we need. And then I said predefined credentials. Again, we set up our Airtable credentials over here. I click send body JSON using JSON, and then you'll see it says define automatically by the model. So how you can get that is you click these stars and then this automatically grabs it with the model. So we're good to go on that side of things. And just to test this out, this is what I sent initially. So I said add n8n error handling. This video will have an example of an error trigger and workflow. I want this added on 11/10/2025. It's in progress. So we're going to send that as a message. I'm going to click over here to open message. And yeah, let's clear that out over here. Make this a little bit larger. Cool. And we're just going to send this over here. 3, 2, 1. And you'll see it runs over here. It goes to our chat model, which I didn't even show you the chat model. I just used GPT-5 mini. I'll show this to you in a second once it goes through and adds our record to Airtable. Hopefully no errors, and it's great the first time. And you can see it went into the tool and it says over here, done. I've added the following record: topic name, n8n error handling, description, status. And then let's take a look. So let's go into our calendar and you'd see it says n8n error handling, right? In progress 11/10. So awesome. This worked as expected. Some people want to add in a bunch of tools to an AI agent. Some people want to rather have this in orchestration. Again, it just really depends on how you want to specifically build this out. But I had to share this with you because I felt like it was really, really important. All right, so up next, and I apologize if this starts getting a little too technical, but there is other parts of this that I think are a little bit important. This is an example of showing response codes. And let me also close this chat so we have a little bit more room. So sometimes you're going to have errors with your nodes. And what I want to do is just show you some of the common response codes. So if you get a response code of 200, that means this worked correctly. You don't have to do anything. However, there's 2 response codes that you want to watch out for. And these are either going to be 400s or 500s. So 400s, it's going to be your issue. 500s, it's the API that you're working with's issue. So let me just show you 2 400 examples. It's hard for me to replicate a 500 error because ideally, like most APIs run 99% of the time. And if I want to find a 500, maybe I have to go find a bad API. And I'll be honest, I don't really want to do that for this video. So I just want to show you an example of 404 requests. And then also, this shouldn't be. One of these is 404. One of these, I actually put a 401. I don't know why I put 404 here twice. And we'll go through it. Just show you 400 is a bad request, 401 unauthorized, so a bad API key. 403, you're not allowed to see that data. So for example, in Apify, how some of those showed as gray, like I couldn't use those. Those would be like a 403. The 404 is not found. 429 is a rate limit if you're sending too many requests. We'll cover this over here in the options. 500 is server errors. So you have that. And then also you can try these again if you have an issue, but ideally, like you want to fix your issue. So, all right, I'm back and I just want to show you, I relabeled these. So 404, this one is a URL is not found. And the reason why it's not found is you see we have this expressions. We actually don't have the edit set beforehand. So it's actually going to error out because it has no idea what is going on this side of it. Like obviously we're still seeing everything else, but we don't have the edit set beforehand. And we're going to get the error. So it says the resource you're requesting could not be found. And then it says error details. You click on the from HTTP request and it gives us that 404 error, right? Not found. As I mentioned over here, not found, the URL doesn't exist. And then we have this 401. So this URL does exist. However, we don't have any authentication associated with it. And then you can see we have an error on that side, 401. So what I would recommend is always take a look at your error from the HTTP request and try to match it on this chart. There's other charts that are going to be more extensive. This is just what I wanted to cover for this video. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to talk about a few of the options that are in the HTTP request node. The biggest one that kind of contributes to this video, in my personal opinion, is batching. And the reason why is there's going to be something called a rate limit with an API. And you also see rate limits when you're scraping websites. And the thing with it is an API doesn't want to be constantly hit from companies. So it's going to say, hey, we can only process X amount of records every second or every minute. And this is something you'd find in the documentation. And, you know, luckily in Airtable, it has it right over here. It says guide rate limits. The API is limited to 5 requests per second per base. Additionally, there is a limit of 50 requests per second for all traffic using personal access tokens from a given user or service account. If you exceed these rate limits, you'll receive a 429 status code. You'll have to wait 30 seconds before subsequent requests. So it tells you that over here. Which again, if you go over here, 429, I said too many requests. And there's a few different ways that you could figure out how to solve rate limits. Natively, there's batching in here. So it's a full process. You can set items per batch and then the interval in milliseconds as well. So this is one way of stopping rate limiting issues. Another way that I find is helpful is loops. You can just go over here to loop over items. And then also set in a wait node. And I've covered this in extensive details in that video for loops. But like this is another common case like, hey, you know, we're going to loop these over. Let's say we have this in over here. Okay, we're going to hit this HTTP request. We're going to wait. And then we're going to go over here. And again, you can set your batch size specifically in here. So like for your workflow, if you want to have as small nodes as possible, like maybe you just go over here and you add batching directly into this node. If it helps you, I'm taking a look at the loop over items, like you could do that as well. But yeah, you have both these options on that side of things, right? So you can batch directly in your HTTP request. You could loop over items. I think probably the preferred way is just set this option in the HTTP request. But the other thing too is when you're working with nodes in here for different APIs, they don't always have batching directly in them. And that's why loop over items exist. Other things is like timeout is like how long do you want to wait before a request fails. So you can just see over here, we have this timeout option. So you can wait and you can also actually retry. So you can see it says like retry on failure. So if it fails, like you can say, oh, I want to try this 3 times or how many times you want to try across the board, right? Again, you can combine that with the timeout on the side. So there's that. And then lastly, sometimes you'll have to send lowercase headers, like you'll find it in the documentation or not. There's other options over here, like proxies, pagination, responses, redirects, things like that. But sometimes you'll have to deal with lowercase headers. I wouldn't really ignore SSL issues on that side of things, like that's insecure as it mentions over here. So, but I find like typically you might want to set some sort of batching over here and sometimes use timeout. So I just wanted to show you guys that. All right, lastly, like your final tips. Number 1, let's just kind of reiterate everything we learned today. And I know it's been a long video. I think this is over an hour. So I try to make a super in-depth video for you guys. But number 1, see if a native node exists or a community node exists. So again, native node, you would find this essentially in cloud. A community node would be self-hosted, although there are some community nodes here in cloud. I'd also check if it has everything that you need. Sometimes you're going to be limited. Like it's very common with Airtable to be limited with what you need. Same with HubSpot and some of these others. Again, it has some framework of what you need, but it's not always going to have everything. So if it doesn't have everything, you're going to need the HTTP request. If it doesn't exist, you need the HTTP request. Number 2 is read the API docs before setting up an HTTP request. This has a lot of options. You might be confused on where to go, but if you go through the documentation and really think it through, like, it'll show you how to set everything up. Curl is your shortcut. So if curl exists on the documentation, start with curl, then look at setting up the authentication correctly. Right. Make sure you have the right API method, whether it's a post or if it's a patch, a delete or get. Make sure you're using that. Set up authentication once you're ready. If sending a ton of data, look at rate limits, possible error, which again goes up into our 429 error, which is going to be too many requests. You're going to have to batch, whether in the HTTP request node or a loop over items. If an error exists, check the status code. So we showed you 401, 404. You might get one of these errors. These are the most common ones, 400s, 500s. It's not your fault. I'll just check later. And then, if it's not your fault, make sure that's happening. And lastly, don't leak your API keys, because someone may spend a lot of money on your dime. And lastly, if you want n8n to act as an API, well, that's my next video in this series, which is going to be webhooks. I assume webhooks is going to be just as in-depth as this one. My goal is to make the best n8n content on YouTube for you guys. So I hope you enjoy it. And again, we have covered quite a lot. Feel free to rewatch sections. Just remember, get, post, put, patch. Get, you retrieve data. Post, you create data. Put, patch, you update the data. Delete is you remove your data. Your URL is going to be your API endpoints. Curl is going to be your shortcut and lifesaver. You have 3 different sections: the query perimeter, header, and body. Typically, you'll find the data for your request in your bodies, but sometimes you're going to have to put this in your query of some sort. Header, sometimes will have your API keys on that side of it. Authentication is very, very important. Remember, the biggest thing with authentication is, set up those predefined credentials or generic credentials. Otherwise, someone can steal your information if you're sharing a workflow. And that's pretty much it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have other videos you want me to make here in the future, let me know. These are your response codes. You don't have to memorize them, but you'll pick them up fairly quickly if you work with APIs a bit. And webhooks will be next. Subscribe, and I will catch you guys in another video.